Well, just a few weeks ago, I learned that for the first time in its history, Harvard University, which was instituted for religious purposes, it was named for a minister of the gospel. For the first time in its history, the incoming freshman class at Harvard has more atheists and agnostics than professed Christians and Jews. And at the same time, I learned, almost simultaneously, that the legislature out in California had voted for assisted suicide, to legalize assisted suicide. And in fact, now the governor has in fact signed that bill into law. Now, I know it might seem a little bit peculiar, but I think there's a very strong connection between those two facts. The freshman class at Harvard, now predominantly atheist and agnostic, and the passing of the assisted suicide law. Now, how come? Why do I say it? Well, first of all, we shouldn't be too surprised that this incoming class of sort of the future American aristocracy is becoming increasingly non-religious. These young people have been, bathed for their whole lives in the corrosive acids of relativism and materialism and scientism. They've been given pretty much anything that money can buy, but they've been denied, sadly, the thing that the human heart most longs for, which is the transcendent. Another way of saying, with the good, true, and beautiful in their unconditioned form. That's what the human heart wants the most. Any of the goods of the world, they're fine, but they will not satisfy the deepest longing. And so if you are raised in that kind of culture, well then, the secularist, atheist point of view is going to seem natural. Paul Tillich, the Protestant theologian, long ago taught us that human beings are built for worship. We're built to worship God, and in the absence of God, we'll worship something else. We won't stop worshiping, we'll worship something else. Namely, something else will be of highest value. I've often spoken about wealth, pleasure, honor, and power as the four great substitutes. I think in our time, though, another one's emerged, which is freedom itself. Freedom itself has become the absolute value, what we worship in our secular culture. My capacity, in other words, to create myself. That seems to be the unassailable value. That's what we worship. But now contrast that to the Bible. Go back to the very beginning of the Bible, the book of Genesis. What do you find but God's good creation getting off the rails precisely at the moment when human beings decided we can create ourselves? So in that inexhaustibly beautiful poetry of Genesis, when they grasp at the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, what that is a grasping at self-invention, self-creation, putting themselves in the place of God. And that's precisely where things go bad on the biblical reading. Now read the chapters following the description of the fall, all the way up to the call of Abraham, and you find in beautifully encapsulated form all the permutations and combinations of human dysfunction, from violence and fratricide and jealousy and imperialism. All of it is on display. And it follows from this grasp at self-deification, self-creation. What's God's project? His project is called a people Israel. And the people Israel are a people now formed after his own mind and heart. A people who will, in a peculiar way, listen to God, be shaped by God's mind, by God's purposes. I think beautifully, the term Israel has the sense in Hebrew of someone who wrestles with God. Beautiful, isn't it? Jacob is given that name, Israel, because he wrestled all night with the angel. But that's a wonderful way to put it, is the human project is not a self-sustaining project, not a self-creating project, but rather we become ourselves, paradoxically, in the measure that we wrestle with God, that we engage with God. When we stop wrestling with God, we stop being Israel, then we go off the rails. Now, when did that project reach its climax, its fulfillment? Well, on the Christian reading, in this Israelite named Yeshua from Nazareth, who is fully human, an Israelite, shaped according to the law and the formation of Israel, who is also at the same time true God. He's faithful Yahweh meeting faithful Israel. He's humanity now formed perfectly in relation to the living God. That's why we call Jesus the Savior, the one that heals the problem. He heals the wounds of the human race. Now look at someone like St. Paul, who was fully formed in the Israelite tradition, knew the whole biblical thing I've been talking about. When he meets the risen Jesus, what does he do? Is he utterly turns his life over to him. So Paul can say, it's no longer I who live, it's Christ who lives in me. His life isn't about him, it's about Christ. He can say that he's the doulos Christou Jesu. That means he's the slave of Christ Jesus. He can call Jesus blithely, my Kyrios, my Lord. Well, who's the Lord but the one to whom your allegiance is due, the one that you've given your life to? You're the slave of this Lord. But see, in all that, what does Paul find? Freedom. It's not a dehumanizing move. Read Paul's letters. Do you ever get the sense that here's someone that's not, confident, that doesn't have a keen sense of himself? Of course not. He becomes fully himself in the measure that he is Israel. How wonderful, by the way, he calls the church the new Israel. So now the new people that on purpose wrestle with God, that's how they find themselves. I would argue that up and down the centuries to the present day, that's still the great task of the church, the new Israel, is to teach the human race how to find themselves precisely in relation to God. Now, all this brings me back to the Harvard class and assisted suicide. See, if you say there's no God or God's an irrelevancy, then your life belongs to you. It's your life. Do with it what you want. You seek pleasure, you seek happiness the way you see fit. And when your life becomes tiresome or boring or a burden on other people, well, isn't it your prerogative to snuff it out? When someone else's life, the unborn, the elderly, become burdensome, annoying, well, shouldn't we have the right in law to get rid of them? See, a deep indifference to human life will follow immediately from the bracketing of God. Because then my life belongs to me, and human life in general belongs to us. We can decide what to do with it. The biblical view is, no, your life does not belong to you. It's a gift from God. It finds itself in relation to God. And so here's the paradox. I know that modern philosophy has taught us now for centuries that somehow belief in God is dehumanizing. On the contrary, I would argue. What's truly dehumanizing is the bracketing of God. What threatens life is atheism, is the setting aside of God. When we are willing to wrestle with God, then we really find who we are. And that's why, see, I find it's a portentous omen that this freshman class in the most elite university in America is now predominantly atheist or agnostic. That's not just a trivial fact. Atheism is not a parlor game. Atheism represents a supreme threat to humanity. During the Pope's recent visit to America, I had the privilege of being on as a commentator for NBC News and MSNBC. And I was on for extended periods with Brian Williams and with Chris Matthews. Brian, of course, up to recent years was the anchor of NBC Nightly News, now at MSNBC. Chris Matthews, the host of Hardball. And I must say, both men are very good at what they do, namely keeping a conversation going for 2 or 3 hours among a variety of people. Like most people who are good at what they do, they make it look very easy. But try that sometime. Try just to keep a conversation going, well organized, interesting, lively for 2 or 3 hours. So they're great at what they do, and actually I very much enjoyed being with both of them. But I want to share a moment I had with each one of these commentators that I think says something about the church and the church's teaching. So Chris Matthews, like a lot of Catholics of his generation, is more liberally minded when it comes to issues, especially of women in the church. And a couple times, his job is to be provocative. And he said, Bishop, isn't it just a matter of simple justice? I mean, why can't women be priests? And let's face it, men are management and the women do all the grunt work in the church. And one time he said to me, isn't it odd that all the bishops are Republicans and all the nuns are Democrats? Well, again, he was trying to be provocative and stir the pot. But what I tried to do is follow the advice of the great philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, who famously said, sometimes the key to solving a problem in philosophy is to let the fly out of the fly bottle. It's a neat little image. What he means is a lot of the problems we have in philosophy are a matter of getting stuck around a couple of maybe binary options, and we just keep bumping our head against the side of the bottle. We're setting the whole thing in a different context, changing the whole setting for the question, can actually let the fly out of the fly bottle. So in this case, women in the church, what I suggested was we get hung up on the issue of power and priesthood, as though the priesthood is the focus of power. I urge Chris Matthews and his millions of listeners to say, go back to Vatican II, the great teaching of Vatican II on the universal call to holiness, on the role of the laity in the church. Now, what is that role? The role of the laity is to sanctify the world. Having been sanctified by the priests, who through the sacraments, through preaching and so on, sanctify them, now their job as great Catholic teachers and lawyers and physicians and writers and commentators and politicians and so on, their job now is to sanctify the social order, to sanctify the world. That's where the power of the laity lies, see. Not so much in fussing around with the inner ecclesial power, but the power to change the world. That's what Vatican II wanted. And then I urged him and his listeners to look at some of the really great female saints in recent years, recent centuries now. Go back to Bernadette of Lourdes, the 19th century. The Little Flower, end of the 19th century. Mother Teresa in our own time. Mother Catherine Drexel. All those women were far more powerful than 99% of the priests and bishops of their time. Now why? Because they were saints. And being a saint, someone whose holiness sanctifies the world, that's the key to real power. See, I think if we get off of the question of priesthood, that priesthood is the key to power, we can actually let the fly out of the fly bottle. Here's the second instance now I want to share with you, this one dealing with Brian Williams. It was the very end of our coverage, the very end of the Pope's Mass in Philly. And Brian Williams was on now anchoring a whole variety of people, commentators. And he said, isn't it kind of funny with this synod on the family coming up, at the time it was coming up the following week. He said that people without families are the ones who are making all the rules about families. So, the priests and bishops who are celibate, what do they know about family life? So they went around, a number of people, commented on that, most approvingly, most saying, oh yeah, that's a good point. Well, I wasn't called on, but I just felt obligated to jump in. So I said, may I speak as the only one on the panel who is actually celibate? And I said, Brian, if I can use an adage from the scholastic philosophers, nego maiorem, which means I deny the major premise. In other words, I deny the major premise of your observation, that priests are not family men. And then I drew attention to this ring, which I got when I was ordained a bishop. And I said, this ring is a wedding ring that binds me to my people. In fact, we're explicitly told in the manual for bishops that you should never take this ring off. The same way a devoted husband wouldn't take off his wedding ring. It's a sign that I'm a family man, that I'm married and I have children. I have spiritual children. And then I quoted, I was happy I was able to do this. I quoted my mentor, Cardinal George, who used to say all the time out at the seminary, you are not bachelors, you're all married men, and you have children, spiritual children. The trouble he felt with a lot of the scandals in the priesthood was priests start falling into the trap of thinking they're bachelors. Basically, untethered, free, unmarried men. No, you're married. You're married to the church because you're in the persona Christi, and Christ is the bridegroom of his bride, the church. So my point there was, don't think of priests as not family men. On the contrary, priests are very intensely family men. This too now is a Vatican II teaching. Vatican II stressed how celibacy and marriage are co-implicative. They're mutually reinforcing. They're not rival states of affairs, not rival ways of being. But the stronger celibacy is, the stronger marriage is. The stronger marriage is, the stronger celibacy is. The two are mutually implicative. Karol Wojtyła, when he came back from Vatican II as Archbishop of Krakow, led the people of that diocese in a careful study of the documents of Vatican II. I have long felt that that was a key to the reception of Vatican II in his diocese. They got it. In a way, I think a lot of people in our country didn't get it. I would maintain that the documents of Vatican II are still largely unread. What people got was the amorphous, spirit of Vatican II. They got instincts that supposedly came out of Vatican II. Read the documents. What you're going to find is a stress on the mutuality of celibacy and married life, and you're going to find both celibacy and married life are in service of the sanctification of the world. And that's where real power lies. See, I think the key to letting a lot of these flies out of the fly bottle is a careful reading of Vatican Well, reliable sources tell me that Bill Nye for the millennial generation is a major figure because of his program, Bill Nye, the Science Guy. I must say, I've never seen the program, but I guess for 20-somethings and 30-somethings, Bill Nye was an important figure. And I'll certainly take their word for it on science. I guess he led young people through experiments and sort of taught them the basics of the scientific method. But I just saw him on a video talking about the relation between science and philosophy. And I can tell you that he might be the science guy, but he sure is not the philosophy guy. In a kind of rambling answer to a question about philosophy, he said, well, philosophy never seems to deviate from common sense. Philosophy doubts sense experience, and philosophers worry about things like whether we're part of an intergalactic ping pong match. Well, I wasn't entirely clear what he meant, but with regard to the first one, heck, from Socrates on, it's almost a commonplace that philosophers do deviate from common sense. They say things that are surprising and so on and so forth. Doubting sense experience, well, people like, Descartes and Hume did that, but really as part of a sort of epistemological experiment. Not so much a claim that the sensible world is not real. It was more part of a epistemological experiment. Are we part of a intergalactic ping pong match? Well, that to me sounds like more of an LSD trip than any serious philosopher I've ever read. My point is, I don't think he knows an awful lot about philosophy. And what undergirds his statement is something I've been concerned about for a long time, namely scientism. Scientism is, to put it bluntly, a reduction of all knowledge to the scientific form of knowledge. Now, the problem is the scientific form of knowledge has been massively successful, as we all know. Thank God. It's developed in the late 16th, early 17th century. The scientific method, that you empirically observe, you form hypotheses, you experiment to test hypotheses, and then you repeat experiments to confirm what you've determined. That method, simple enough to state, but that method has had massive success all over the world, and its attendant technologies have crucially improved human life. And so no one doubts the success and the beauty and legitimacy of the scientific method. But in some ways, its very success is the problem. It carries a shadow, namely a sort of epistemological imperialism. Science now is the only way that we can know reality. Watch Carl Sagan's Cosmos from the 1970s to see a full-blown version of this. But you sense it too in Bill Nye's kind of dismissal of a discipline he knows almost nothing about, clearly, philosophy, in the name of a sort of triumphant science. See, go back now to the very beginning of philosophy. Go back to Plato. Plato gives us the still compelling parable of the cave. You want to see that repeated, by the way, look at The Matrix as a good example of it. The parable of the cave, Plato imagines people who are chained inside a cave. All they see are the flickering shadows on the wall. One of the prisoners manages to escape, makes his way out of the cave up into the higher world, and he sees, the real three-dimensional things. And then he finally looks up to the sun, the very source of all light and knowledge. Okay. It's a beautiful metaphor, still powerful, as I say, for the advance beyond a merely empirical sort of science. The world that I can see, the world that I can measure, the world I can hypothesize about, now use 17th century language, or experiment upon that world. There's a transcendence of that world which is possible, a moving into a higher realm of the more intelligible and the more fully real, and finally an intellectual contemplation of the source of all knowledge and reality. See, Plato's cave is a metaphor of this, call it epistemological liberation from the merely empirical. Plato's successor and disciple, the great Aristotle, who always spoke in a little more prosaic manner than his master, expressed the idea in terms of the ascent of knowledge. So Aristotle knows about physics, the study of matter and motion, he would have known. That would correspond more or less to what we would know by the physical sciences. So Aristotle loved that and writes a whole book on physics. But beyond the physics, he first sees mathematics, the study of abstract forms and mathematical patterns, etc. But then beyond mathematics is the metaphysica in his Greek, what's beyond the physics, beyond the measurable, empirically determinable world, the higher realm. And reason has a lot to say about the metaphysical realm. Read, if you doubt me, his great treatises on metaphysics, and then coming from Aristotle all the way up to Heidegger, read philosopher after philosopher, who does a rational examination of the metaphysica, what lies beyond the physics. What we see in scientism, it seems to me, is a tremendous reduction and impoverishment of the idea of rationality. If we reduce rationality to what Aristotle would call the physics, we're forgetting enormous realms that can and should be explored by reason. Now, I'll make it a little more concrete. I love physics, and the study of the world and experimental science, et cetera, et cetera. And physics might tell you a lot about, the composition of matter and the composition of the pages that make up a book, et cetera. But physics qua physics will never tell you a thing about the meaning of Melville's Moby Dick or of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. It can't, even in principle. Biology can tell you all about muscles and nerves and bodily patterns and so on and so forth, but it can't begin to tell you why a given act is moral or immoral. Astrophysics might even tell you about, the singularity from which the Big Bang, and from which the universe comes. But astrophysics qua astrophysics can't tell you a thing about the relationship between contingent being and non-contingent being. Or to put it in Heidegger's language, it can't tell you why there's something rather than nothing. There are higher forms of reason that lie beyond the merely scientific. And now here's a more general issue, and Bill Nye brought it to my mind. The crisis of the humanities in our educational system. And you see it in university after university, where a lot of the humanities programs are struggling. Sciences, oh yeah, everyone gets that, and engineering and the practical application of the sciences, everyone gets that. But the humanities, poetry and art and literature and philosophy are suffering. But this means what? It means that we are imprisoning ourselves now inside of Plato's cave. We're content to talk about the evanescent and passing physical world with great accuracy and with great utility. but we are chaining ourselves in place so that we cannot get out of the cave and see the higher realms. So see, my worry, especially for the millennial generation that would look to someone like Bill Nye as a model, that we're going to get a generation that is just permanently stuck inside of Plato's cave. Fleming Rutledge's book, The Crucifixion, is one of the best theology books I've read in the last 10 years. She's a theologian, but also well known in the Episcopal tradition as a preacher. I like how her book is full of illumination for the mind, but it also can preach. There are some books of theology you read and you say, well, that's interesting, but I mean, I'd never use that in a homiletic setting. Her book you could really use, and you can tell it's from the pen of a thinker and a preacher. There's so much of interest in it. I just want to, for the sake of this video, talk about a couple of things. I hope to do some more videos down the line about it. It's that rich a book. The first theme, and it kind of haunts the whole text, is the sheer strangeness of the cross. She wants to defamiliarize the cross. She wants to de-domesticate the cross. So we see it in all of its sort of awful power. She begins with a text from Paul, Romans 1:16, where Paul says, and we sort of take it for granted, we've heard it so often, Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It's, the power to save both Jews and Gentiles. But that opening phrase, the more you think about it, the stranger it becomes. I'm not ashamed of the gospel. Well, she says, the Buddha offering his teaching might expect people not to agree with it. But would the Buddha ever say, I'm not ashamed of what I'm. Well, I mean, why would you be ashamed of it? Or Muhammad, I mean, maybe he knew people wouldn't accept it, some. But would he ever say, I'm not ashamed of the Quran? Well, no. I mean, Confucius wouldn't say that about his teaching. Why in the world would Paul have to sort of make this apology? Hey, but I'm not ashamed. It's because he's declaring something that at the time would have struck people as supremely strange. That you would associate euangelion, right, good news, with the cross, with someone who'd been crucified. That was an anomaly to the extreme in the ancient world. And that's why he has to say, hey, I'm not ashamed of it, because you'd expect he would be. That's the point. Anyone speaking of the cross is speaking of the most shameful thing you could imagine. So Rutledge insists upon this, I think, quite correctly. It's not enough to say that Jesus died. So he died for our sins. Sure. That's not enough. Nor is it enough to say, he was put to death, by powerful and wicked people. That's not enough. He accepted, Paul says, even death on a cross. Paul says furthermore, I preach one thing, Christ and him crucified. Not just I preach one thing, Christ. Okay, I get that. But Christ and him crucified. The weirdness of the cross belongs to the very heart of the gospel, and that should give us pause. Again, why? Well, our problem is that we've so domesticated the cross. So it's up on our walls as a decoration. We wear it as jewelry on our necks. We're so used to seeing it, we say, oh yeah, that's a lovely religious symbol. Go back to Paul's time. Go back to the first century. The cross, or better, someone dying on a cross, was about the worst, ugliest, most dehumanizing and shameful thing you could imagine. So, when someone was crucified, first of all, they were stripped naked. So we see images of Jesus with the loincloth. Well, that's really ahistorical. I mean, he would have been naked on the cross. So humiliated right away, utterly exposed in the most shameful way, especially for a Jew, mind you. Affixed to this, cross beam, which was then placed in an upright beam. The person was nailed or sometimes tied to this device, and then allowed to hang there. And the great torture, they say, of the cross was this very slow process of asphyxiation. So as you're trying to breathe, you have to literally rock up and down on your wounded wrists and wounded feet. So every one of those moves, excruciatingly painful. And again, that word excruce, from the cross. So our word for paradigmatic pain comes from the cross, excruciating pain. But you're slowly suffocating. Your own bodies become your enemy because you can't get your breath. People on the cross would last hours and hours and hours, sometimes days and days. Imagine being in this state, of course, not fed, not hydrated anyway, allowed basically to torture yourself to death on this horrific instrument. More to it, when you died, your body was typically left on the cross, so it could be picked over by the birds of the air and the scavenging animals. The point here is, it was utterly dehumanizing. The way you treat an insect or a very objectionable animal. That's the level you've been reduced to. Cicero referred to it simply and tellingly as the summum supplicium, the limit case of punishment, the worst kind of punishment. That's what you people are talking about? So imagine the first hearers of the good news. I preach one thing, Christ and Him crucified. What in the world are you talking about? The point is, only when we get this sort of horrific quality of the cross do we begin to understand its power and why Paul declared it precisely as power. And this conduces now to the second point that Rutledge makes, and I want to emphasize, which is the seriousness of sin. Now, this is a big problem in our time. It's a big problem in our time. I'm okay, you're okay, I'm beautiful in every way, my will triumphs over everything, I am what I want to be, don't tell me I've done anything wrong. All of that is in our culture, right? Which does away with the weight of sin. And press it another way, too. She comments that we have the tendency, in the wake of terrible evil, let's say one of these school shootings, is right away, look, all you got to do is offer a blithe word of forgiveness. So, do you forgive those who killed your friends? Just go ahead and forgive them. As though that's enough. As though that's enough to address the weight of sin. She makes the point, and it's absolutely right, that in the Bible, it's not so much sins, the particular bad things we do, but sin as a condition that we're in. It's like a disease. It's like an addiction. More than the things that I do, it's the state that has gripped me. And don't we know it? Think of, the tragedies happening all over the world. How do I respond to that? Whether it's a shooter going into a nightclub, whether it's someone who's blowing up an airport, whether it's someone shooting up a high school. Well, now what do? Now solve that problem. Oh, a word of forgiveness, or let's go in there and we'll get some better police protection. I mean, give me a break. These things are expressive of a dysfunction so fundamental that we on our own can't handle it. What do we need? We need something to address this problem from outside the human condition. This can't be solved politically, socially, psychologically, by our good efforts. No. Something has to come from the outside, and something awful that matches the awfulness of the condition that we're in. Now, see what she's doing, and I'll say more about it in future videos because it's too much to cover, but now gesturing toward people like St. Anselm. Right? What has to happen for sin to be addressed but the sacrifice of the Son of God? The Son of God moving into the limits of our own dysfunction, taking upon Himself the limit case of the awfulness of sin. Do you see now the point that the awfulness of the cross is a counterweight. It's the only legitimate counterweight to the awfulness of sin. And anything less than that is not taking sin with requisite seriousness. I think those are both extremely important points as we begin now to understand the meaning of Christ's cross.